Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you happen to be watching this lecture. For week 5, for Church History 3, American Christianity, we're going to have 2 lectures. The first will be on the lasting effects of the American Revolution and the changes in American religion and American culture that are notable for history. And the second will be an in-depth focus on the nature, impact, and lasting effect of the Second Great Awakening in American life. As a way of beginning our conversation tonight, I thought I would start with a quote from Alexis de Tocqueville, whose Democracy in America, after his trip to the United States and several visits to the colonies, and then the burgeoning influence across the West in the 1830s, led to the publication of his Democracy in America in the 1830s. And he remarked this, and I'll quote him at length. He said that in the United States, the sovereign authority is religious. There is no country in the world where the Christian religion retains a greater influence over the souls of men than in America. And there can be no greater proof of its utility and of its conformity to human nature than its influence is powerfully felt over the most enlightened and free nation of the earth. The Americans combine the notions of Christianity and of liberty so intimately in their minds that it is impossible to make them conceive of the one without the other. I'll read that last line again. The Americans combine the notions of Christianity and liberty so intimately in their minds that it is impossible to make them conceive the one without the other. This is what he's saying in 1835. If he had been writing in 1785, right on the heels of the American Revolution, I don't think he'd be writing like that. In fact, there was signs of religious decline after the effects of the First Great Awakening into the American Revolutionary era. And in fact, there was certainly it was not for sure that religion would continue to play the impact that it did in American life, especially by the time you get to the 1820s and 30s. And the question is why, right? Why is it that religion that appeared to be perhaps on the decline wound up becoming an absolutely central aspect of American national and democratic identity? And the answer is the Second Great Awakening. We've talked about the flexibility and the adaptability of American religion and American Christianity, the adaptability of Christianity in general to multiple cultural contexts. And we'll see how it weaves together with American democracy in the later decades of the 18th and into the first couple of decades of the 19th century tonight, as we talk about the Second Great Awakening. As we talk about the importance of the Second Great Awakening, I want to quote Mark Noll from his book on the history of American Christianity, and he says this, quote, "The Second Great Awakening was the most influential revival of Christianity in the history of the United States. Furthermore, a good case can be made that Charles Finney should be ranked with Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, and Andrew Carnegie as the most important public figures in the 19th century. Why 9/10 is misspelled, I have no idea. I'm sure it has to do with the haste of my construction of this PowerPoint, so I apologize for that. So what we're talking about is essential understanding, not just for the history of American Christianity, but for the history of the United States, period. We'll start tonight with a conversation about the aftermath of the Revolution and the relationship between church and state that was emerging after the end of the American Revolution. As I mentioned last week, Massachusetts had local communities supporting the local Congregational Church well into the 19th century. In fact, on the heels of the Revolution, 5 states provided tax support for ministers at their churches, and 7 states actually had religious tests for state offices. It was only Virginia and Rhode Island that actually claimed church and state separation as we tend to understand it and know it today. Federalism actually put these questions onto the states. The issue was not whether or not a state could have at least some vestiges of religious establishment. The question was whether or not the federal government could. So it's important to understand that moving forward. But even when it comes to federal government, we have this central conundrum in American history at the time, especially in the late 18th and early 19th century, is how do you explain a nation that formally separates church from the state and sponsors national days of prayer, begins congressional sessions with a Christian prayer, and even has paid federal chaplains in Congress and in the military? The United States, sort of a funky place in the role that religion plays in its life. I think I may have mentioned to you in one of our conversations already this semester that I did some work with business people coming to the United States and getting some cultural training on what it was like to live in the U.S. And they remarked, in our country, we learned that the United States has the separation of church and state, but I've never seen a more religious place in my life. Help me understand that. Well, once you unhinge the church from the state formally at the federal level, what you create is an open marketplace for religion and the coming of the Great Awakening. It also is the birth of what we might come to know and understand as civil religion in American life. Civil religion refers to a set of beliefs, practices, and symbols that are used to express a collective identity and unify a nation or society. Civil religion often incorporates religious elements, but its primary focus is on fostering loyalty, patriotism, and a sense of shared purpose within a national context, and less about formal Christian worship. It involves the idea that a nation has a sacred purpose or destiny. It's often depicted through national rituals and symbols like flags and anthems, and leaders who are seen as carrying out a divine mission. In the United States, for example, this can be seen in the reverence for the Constitution, national holidays like Independence Day, the 4th of July, and references to God in the Pledge of Allegiance and on our currency. Civil religion isn't tied to any particular religion and borrows elements from multiple faiths, primarily Christianity, to create a sense of national unity and national transcendence, linking political institutions with moral values and social ideals. As we enter into this period of social and civil religion, we also have a different thinkers espousing different understandings of what it means for the church and the state to be separate. Thomas Jefferson, who you see on the right, didn't label his picture. I figured you knew who he was. And James Madison had what we might sort of refer to as the way that we tend to think about what that term means, as a wall of separation, like Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptists. The full and equal participation in public life on equal terms, and this is the way Jefferson put it, quote, for the Jew, the Gentile, the Christian, and the Mohammedan, the Hindu, and the infidel of every denomination, unquote. In this particular context, there was no religious test. There was no formal link between the machinery of the state and the church. But you get a different story from, a pun, no pun intended, from Joseph Story, who was from Massachusetts and was was a first member of the United States Supreme Court. Clearly, he did not want any one church supported by the state, no religious establishment. But at the same time, he felt that the general promotion of Christianity was necessary to ensure the health of the American Republic and a moral framework for the country. So the First Amendment, in his imagination, allowed, quote, Christianity to receive encouragement from the state so far as was not incompatible with the private rights of conscience and the freedom of religious worship, unquote. As long as people were not coerced to worship in any particular way, and as long as people maintained the personal private right of conscience, then he said that Christianity could receive the encouragement from the state in religious and public civic practice. So we move out into a new era now with a new understanding that religion, while not the same as the state, was certainly deeply involved in it. In addition to this understanding, we have a growth and understanding of the rise of populist democracy in American life. One way of thinking about this shift in American social values and mores, and I may have mentioned this the other day, but in the streets of Boston before the Revolution, you were expected to doff your cap to your social betters on the street. And as early as the signing of the actual peace that ended the revolution, that practice ended overnight. Suddenly, the the practices of deference ended quickly. In addition, we see the decline of Calvinism. This will be a theme that we talk about a lot tonight, because Calvinism as a set of theological principles is not friendly to the empowered individual, which was so central to religion in the early republic in American life. We also see the rise of revivalism, and as part of that process, the rise of revival religion, we see a change in denominational consciousness and identity. Both the Episcopalians in Virginia and the Congregationalists in New England declined in influence and number, and the number of Baptists and Methodists absolutely exploded across the country in this particular period. We also see the rise of millenarianism and Wesleyan perfectionism, right? This idea that you can live a perfect and sinless life. As part of this particular movement, we see something that I do think is important to recognize as influential in American life, and the blending of Christianity and democracy, is the resentment of any hierarchy of any kind, and the rise of a new set of religious movements called the Restoration Movement, what become known as the Christian churches, or the Disciples of Christ, or the Church of Christ. These come out of an understanding of what we call biblical primitivism or biblicism in American religious life. When you do not have an established church, and you do not have one dominant set of practices or one denomination that dominates public and civic life, you have to come up with a different basis for what it means to be a Christian. And here we see a rise of a new set of movements that emphasized the Bible. They called it the Bible-only movement in American life. And if you think about it this way, if you diminish traditional authority, something else has to take its place. And that something else is the Bible, which is why evangelicalism becomes so biblicistic and primitivistic. And if you want to get rid of hierarchy, you avoid history, you go back to the New Testament and say, we want to do it the way they did it. History, bad, because it adds all kinds of levels of authority and hierarchy. Ancient world, pure Bible authority, good. It's a theme that continues on through American life, in through the 19th and 20th century into American evangelicalism. Well, as part of this understanding then of, before we get to the rise of the Restoration Movement, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking specifically about that in just a minute, I want to take a brief historical aside. This may seem like a little bit too long. You read a little bit about it in your textbook, but I think it's absolutely essential, not only for the coming of the Second Great Awakening, but of a sort of change of perspective that will heavily influence all of American religious life after the late 18th century. And it is the rise of a new school of thought in Scotland and Ireland, and it eventually transitions into the United States in intellectual circles, and it's called Scottish Common Sense Realism. The two primary thinkers associated with this movement are Francis Hutcheson and Thomas Reid. Scottish realism was used to justify the revolution. It was seen as an authority that led to the language of truths being self-evident. Think about what a move that is on behalf of Thomas Jefferson in the first lines of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. You don't have to prove them. You don't have to make an argument for them. You just look at reality, and they're obviously true. And by the way, they obviously true what I happen to think. It's quite a bold move there intellectually. And they also, the Scottish Common Sense Realism also established a solid ground for Christian teaching with the absence of any kind of authoritative established church. So I want to talk for just a few minutes with you, if I can, about Scottish Common Sense Realism as it developed in the late 18th century, as it offered a direct challenge to skepticism and idealism that were prominent at the time, particularly those associated with David Hume and Immanuel Kant. Those of you who are history of philosophy folks, we can spend a little bit of time ironing some of this out if you'd like to. there's lots of ways to explain and understand the basic tenets of Scottish common sense realism, but I narrowed it here for our purposes down to four. Get in the screen. All right, number one, that common sense is the foundation of knowledge. Human beings are naturally and reliably able to perceive the world as it truly is by trusting their senses. This common sense refers to a basic everyday knowledge that we all share and use to navigate the world. When you see something and it appears to be true, it makes obvious sense. Hume actually in his skepticism would say that when you can't really trust your senses, because when you see something, the cause and effect might not be as it appears. But instead, objects exist in this understanding independent of our perception of them. This stood in stark contrast to a more abstract philosophical speculation theory of those like David Hume and others who questioned the certainty of human knowledge. Epistemologically, there was such thing as obvious fact of independent, objective reality, and your brain can comprehend it. That's the first point. The second that makes that possible is this idea of a trust in sensory perception, that the senses provide direct and accurate knowledge of the world as it actually is. Instead of treating perception as something unreliable or requiring deep intellectual abstraction, the common sense realists suggested that the senses can be trusted as reliable sources for information about the world. And then third, objective reality is real. Something exists outside of the mind's ability to comprehend it. Objective reality just simply is, regardless of whether or not you choose to perceive it. The more idealistic understanding would suggest that reality is actually shaped by our perception of it. But in this world, in this imagination, Scottish realists argue that the world is what it is, regardless of individual belief or perception. And then finally, has to do with human cognition and morality. That thinkers believe that humans are naturally endowed with the ability to discern moral truths and make practical judgments. The moral sense in every person, as it relates to objective reality, was seen as innate in every person, and an aspect of the mind that allows people to intuitively understand what is right and what is wrong, and truth from falsehood. In this world, then, it is a focus on moral integrity that arises out of right government, that is rooted in fundamental basic reality. So then, just why is this so significant on American Christianity? Well, there's a couple things to recognize. I put a couple of thinkers up there, James McCosh and Charles Hodge, both at Princeton, centrally significant in the unfolding of a Princeton theology, a Presbyterian understanding, but they were really the inheritors of the Scottish common sense realistic philosophical approach as it was expressed in the American context. First of all, it's important to recognize that it transforms American theology. It created a rational and accessible framework for understanding the existence of God and the moral order. Thinkers like John Witherspoon and Samuel Miller brought the philosophy to America, where it resonated with Christian notions of natural law and human perception of the divine order. It also had an emphasis on practical reasoning and morality. Therefore, it was popularly appealing. It appealed to the masses. It focused on the reliability of everyday experience. I got to come up with a way to get rid of these alerts that are coming up on my screen all the time. And it helps promote a Christian faith that was grounded in reason, morality, and personal experience, rather than any kind of abstract theological or speculative ideas. This made Christianity very accessible. It also was rooted in foundationalist epistemology. If you've never taken a philosophy course, suffice it to say this. This is the Cartesian foundationalism upon which you create a foundation of human knowledge from which all is derived. all epistemologically, morally, and ethically, and theologically, from one common ground of obvious objective truth. This emphasis of common sense on objective reality provided a philosophical foundation for a religious epistemology that was rooted in personal experience of the natural world. The result, right, was an emphasis on knowledge, right understanding that was translated into personal piety, the experience of God in everyday life, and the certainty, the absolute fundamental reliability and certainty of religious truths. I put it here on the screen as the foundation of apologetics, American style. You'll see all the way well into the 20th century that this whole realm of thinking called apologetics rests on this idea of objective truth and foundationalist epistemology. And it is that epistemology, actually, that is up for grabs in this post-industrial, postmodern world, which is why the underpinnings of traditional Christian apologetics, as we understand them, really since the 1970s, has come under attack. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about that later on in the term. Finally, I just mentioned Francis Wayland, who was a Baptist minister who applied common sense realism as the basis for, notice what he talked about now, educational reform, moral reform, moral philosophy, right? This was the crowning course that every liberal arts college student took throughout the 19th century, moral philosophy or ethics. Reform and abolitionism, right? So the ongoing influence and tentacles of common sense realism cannot be overstated for the way that American Christians thought in the early and into the mid-19th century. All right, so with that as a background, let's talk for just a minute a little bit quickly about, you know what, let's go back here. I apologize for the aside there. And it is out of that kind of thinking that we see the rise of what we call the Christian churches or the Restoration movement. You'll see two pictures that I have there of Barton Stone and then the subsequent figure of Alexander Campbell. His father was also influential in the movement. These thinkers eventually formed what we call the Disciples of Christ, very active all the way in America today. And the Churches of Christ, these are American originals, the first American denominations that were uniquely American and democratic. They blended Christianity and democracy. And Barton Stone, Thomas Campbell, and his son Alexander Campbell promoted primitive Christianity and Biblicism as the ultimate authority in place of any kind of established church. It was this particular democratic mindset that, alongside Baptists and Methodists, led to the evangelization of the Upper South and the West into the American frontier into the early and mid-19th century. This allowed new people to translate the Christian faith into a new American idiom, and was very instrumental in changing the face of the church in the 19th century. So now let's talk a little bit before we get on, before we finish here and get to the Second Great Awakening, about some fundamental theological changes that were taking place at this particular time. We could spend a lot of time talking about this. I read a little bit of Mark Noll. I read our textbook, tried to come up with a couple of quick ways to summarize it, and I thought I would just talk briefly about Samuel Hopkins and Timothy Dwight. Samuel Hopkins was a student of Jonathan Edwards, and Timothy Dwight was his grandson. Samuel Hopkins, a minister in New England. Timothy Dwight was actually president at Yale College in the early 19th century. Samuel Hopkins actually revises Jonathan Edwards' Calvinism and challenged what we would call the traditional Christian Orthodox doctrine of original sin, and argued that God actually punishes only the sins that humans actually commit. You're not on the hook for what Adam did. You're on the hook for what you did. Notice this influence, the importance of individual morality, of a structured, empowered individual who is responsible for his or her own moral action. And then Timothy Dwight, who was a New Measures revivalist in New England in the late 18th and early 19th century, believed that God acted through voluntary obedience, not through coercion. Right? If you take extreme sovereignty of God Calvinism, that God is going to get done what God wants to get done, whether or not you want it. If God wants it, it's going to happen, right? But here we have the fact that God presents options and looks for voluntary obedience on the part of the Christian. And he also saw this emphasis less on established church and established authority, but more on the inner workings of the revival experience and the primacy of the Bible to get you there outside of any kind of established church. So things are changing in the American mindset and theological mindset. So now we move on to the Second Great Awakening, and I'll go ahead and stop here for a moment. I'll hit stop. We'll reorganize ourselves, and we'll create another lecture here in just a minute.